every person wrestles with the question of whether or not to forgive, because each one of us in our life will be asked to forgive something. We all trespass against each other just as we are trespassed against. No one makes it through life unscathed, though, of course, pain and injustice are not doled out equally amongst us. Yet each of us is called to really recognize that we too are harmed and to wonder about how to respond. Let me give you a couple of examples of the ways that we sometimes carry this woundedness with us in the world. Take David. David is now a young man wanting to start a family, but he struggles because his own dad left him when he was 8. Never sent a card or a present at Christmas, never called for a birthday, was not there for the various graduations, did not hear the news of David's proposal. And when his father showed up after 25 years, David didn't feel like he had much that was kind to say to his father. Or take Sandra, who was brought to this country when she was 2 by her parents, who grew up here, went to school here, got jobs here, got married here, had 3 beautiful children here. And then one day, when she was 43, she got hit by a car on the way home. And as they were waiting for the police to come to file the reports, the police recognized that she was an undocumented immigrant, and they called ICE, and they worked quickly to deport her. Her children didn't learn at first why their mother didn't come home that night or the next night. And then she found herself, much like Joseph, in a country she didn't know, with a language she didn't speak well, with no friends to help her. She began to feel a lot of anger, not only at that driver who hit her, but the police officer who made a choice, at the ICE agent who just treated her like an object to go through a system, and at President Obama, who was the president at the time of her deportation, who she could not name for all the ferocity in her being. Or take Violet, a single mom who lived in too many communities here in America, who also had 3 kids, and whose son, when he was 7, got shot and killed. Violet tried to move on with her life, but she found herself depressed and anxious, fearful. She struggled to complete school. She was trying to become a teacher, and she just didn't know what to do. She wanted to forgive or move on in some way, but her child's shooter had never been found, and she thought, if I forgive, then I might not try as hard to solve what happened to my son that day. These are cases of clear wounding, but so many of us have these in smaller cases too. I think about workplaces, sometimes jobs that haven't really worked out that well, or a coworker who's sabotaged us in some ways, or how, despite our good work, someone seemingly less deserving has been promoted. I think about us here at church. Almost every year, there's someone whose pastoral need we've neglected to follow up on, either because we didn't know, or we were busy, or we just dropped the ball, but we remembered to call them for their pledge. We all have these cases where our humanity Our need for connection was not respected and met the way we each deserve. Having experienced this level of pain or this level of disappointment, we're all faced with how to respond. Sometimes we respond with anger and vengeance, secret plans to egg someone's house. Sometimes we respond with fear and avoidance. Sometimes we bury that pain so deep inside of us we don't understand how it's corroding our bodies. Other times it lashes out at people disconnected from our pain. We transfer it from one cause to another. These are the kind of common responses and oh so human responses, and they don't work out quite as they should. If you want to know what a world without forgiveness looks like, then you should watch Game of Thrones. If you watch Game of Thrones, you know exactly what I mean. There's just not a lot of forgiveness, and it's really not a pretty world. And yet, if living and responding in an unforgiving way doesn't play out to the world that we want, why is it so hard for us to forgive? One reason it's so hard for us to forgive is that forgiveness is not for wimps. It is not easy to forgive, and I'll go a little bit more into the process of forgiving a little later so you could hear how not easy it is. But that is true, so that's one barrier. The second barrier has a lot to do with our understandings of what justice is. Too many of us still hold the ancient Babylonian notion of justice, an eye for an eye, where we believe that whatever the crime was or the pain delivered should be meted out to the harmer in the same dosage. Another idea is there's an idea of redemptive justice, that the person who committed a crime or a pain should suffer in that until he or she or they learn to do differently. And the third kind of justice that's not very common in the world is restorative justice, which says that the community around the perpetrator learns to respond with love and justice and kindness, as well as learning to establish safety and boundaries. But they establish a kind of being with one another that calls the harming person back into their best selves. Boy, are those communities rare. We often don't forgive because we confuse forgiveness with condoning the actions that were harmful in the first place. We think, to use the stark example, but the most obvious example in our societies, that just because a victim, perhaps, or a survivor, perhaps, decides to personally forgive her rapist, that means she's okay with rape happening. And so whenever we work to forgive, particularly in the most harmful of cases, it's very important to say such actions, such harm are never okay. And we're united to preventing them in each and every case. And yet, there is not where the story should end for any party involved. We often confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. We believe just because we forgive someone, that means we are obligated to want to be in relationship with them or to resume relationship with them. We could forgive someone and enter into a sense of peacefulness of spirit with recognizing that there are some people who are simply not safe to be around or trustworthy in that case. Just because you forgive does not mean that you need to open yourself in all cases to that party again. And finally, sometimes what gets in the way of forgiving are people's theology. There are some theologies that tell us that some people are more worthy in the eyes of their God than others. There are some theologies that tell us that judgment is the norm and forgiveness is offered to the few. There are some theologies that say that compassion is in the hands of the divine alone, and even each person's morality is determined by God, as if we cannot love or forgive or act morally ourselves and by our own determination. Let me be clear that Unitarian Universalism is not one of these theologies. From its very beginning, Universalism has said that each and every person, unworthy on some level that we all are given unmitigated, unearned forgiveness, that we are offered a kind of redeeming love that calls us back to our best selves and that compels us to offer that love forward to each other. Our Unitarian heritage holds up the unbroken continuity of interdependent life. It says we cannot exist without each other. And so we must come in unity of spirit with one another. It reminds us, our Unitarian heritage, that there is a spark of the divine in each and every person, and it is that spark that we kindle into our moral good actions. And so we, particularly, I think, are a people called to forgive, called to the powerful act of forgiveness. Why is forgiveness so powerful? Why does it have a potential to set different patterns in the world? Its power lies in its paradox. Ironically, when we offer love to those that we doubt deserve that love, we ourselves discover a wisdom of how to live in love and forgiveness. When we offer love and forgiveness to those who truly have not earned it, we ourselves discover a kind of wholeness, the wholeness that each one of us seeks in our deepest of beings, a place of peace and contentment and relaxed connectedness. When we forgive, we find that love is more accessible to us. We find that love is deeper and pours out of us more readily. It is a way to lead a life. When we're talking about loving and forgiving like this, it's not a one-time act. Instead, it is the act of living a forgiving life. So how do we do this? Robert Enright wrote a book, The Forgiving Life. I suggested it on your connection card, so you might want to dive into the few hundred pages of it. But just to give you a key few notes from it, the first step towards leading this kind of forgiving life or approaching a relationship of our choosing towards forgiveness is to see, is to really see the humanity in the person we are seeking to forgive. We all know that no person, no unique, special, irreplaceable person, as each and every person is, can be reduced down to their actions. That there's always something more to their story, a layer there that tells us about who they are and reminds us that they are alive and vulnerable and in need of connection too. I think about David and his father and how perhaps what David needed to do was see the humanity of his father a little bit more. Maybe starting at a not so deep level, David would discover that they both have a really special admiration for right fielders who save the day in baseball games. Or maybe they discover that they both love crime mystery novels. Or maybe they discover that David's father left because he could see that he was becoming not such a good dad and a cruel husband, and thought that absence was more compassionate than doing specific acts of harm daily in his life. Perhaps his father wrestled with himself and found the courage to try to seek relationship again and forgiveness. Imagine how David might be transformed by learning about the complexity of his father, and how his father might feel a sense of wholeness and possibility when he's seen with all of those layers. The second step is to feel. And the feeling that we need to do is to feel the real particularities of the harm that have been caused to us. So I think about Sandra, who was deported, and how she felt harmed that day and in that process. She felt harmed by recognizing that her bodily safety was at risk when she got hit by the car. She got harmed by being viewed as a criminal, even though she had never committed a criminal act beyond a misdemeanor in her life. She felt harmed by not being able to see her family again for a long time. And she felt harmed that her children experienced such fear. She felt harmed that she wasn't there to mother them. She felt harmed that her case and the millions of cases like hers didn't warrant a bipartisan response by Congress. She felt harmed that the crackdowns during the Obama administration were used kind of as a political tool to help ripen the field for such legislation. She felt harmed being deposited in a country where she knew no one and felt so utterly vulnerable. She felt harmed by being unable to work when she had been so productive in her past. The harms are specific and deep. Now, it seems sometimes counterintuitive, because when we examine our own lives and we think about the people who have harmed us, I don't know about you, but I get tender and vulnerable real fast. And I don't even really want to be that vulnerable with myself. But when we do that, we begin to discover what is so precious about us as people. And we begin to realize that we are worthy of love. And here is where this other little paradox of forgiveness comes into. Somehow, by really facing that pain, and most importantly, by bearing that pain in its fullness and not transferring it away or not ignoring it deep and shunting it aside, somehow by bearing that pain, we lessen it. And we discover our great capacity to hold our own lives. And we discover a strength and a groundedness that we did not suspect that we had. And then the third step is the step of discovery. And this is where we begin to reap the meaning and the benefits from the process. A few weeks ago, we had a wonderful musician, Matt Meyer, come in, and he sang this song, and the song went, when I sow, those who sow will sow in tears, will reap in joy. And he felt a little uncomfortable because he's like, I don't really want to encourage people to sow in tears. But this is exactly what this process was saying. If we dive into our pain, sometimes we find that we can reap a joy. Viktor Frankl, who himself was a concentration camp survivor during the Holocaust, who wrote about his experiences, stated that he didn't know anyone in the camps who survived without creating meaning from the Holocaust. And that seemed to challenge people. Why should we find meaning, redemptive meaning from the Holocaust? But he said it is meaning that gives us the strength to live. So I want to go back to Violet, the mother who lost her child to gun violence. Once she began to really experience her woundedness, she began to recognize that there was meaning there. She began to recognize that a love for a child cannot be defeated by years or by death or by violence. She began to realize that just because she loses one child, she still had a great capacity to be a wonderful mother to other children. She discovered that there are ways, in addition to grief, to honor a life lost. She honored that by being a good mother. She honored that by her passion of working with young people and pursuing her teaching license. She discovered a meaning that is so tender, which is that even when you suffer what I think is the worst cruelty in the world, which is to bury your own child, that even when you suffer the pain of knowing you will never hold that child in your arms again, which is utterly the delight that makes all the challenges of parenthood worth it, that when someone holds you, when you're in that place, somehow you can make it through. And so Violet learned, in processing her grief and finding these meanings, to show up for her two other children. She learned to pursue and finish that teaching certificate. And she learned and decided to volunteer and to show up that night when another mother in her community lost her child to gun violence, and she learned to be the person to hold that mom. She discovered meaningful ways to live her life in this process of forgiveness. Don't we all yearn to discover the values and meaning in life that will guide us? My dear ones, why do we forgive? We forgive because we want healing for ourselves and the world. We forgive because we recognize that we too need to be forgiven. We recognize because when we try all those other pathways of coping with the pain in the world, we discover that they are simply not enough. We forgive because we recognize that our Unitarian Universalist theology calls for us to forgive, to be compassionate and kind and loving. We recognize that we are moral actors in the world who could set a new pattern. So, my dear ones, how will you learn to forgive? How will you extend forgiveness beyond the small acts? How will you forgive one another this day, this week, this year? I'm so excited for the discoveries ahead.